the regulators. The emphasis is on the plural in the United States. Unlike many other countries, financial regulatory authority is divided among roughly a dozen federal agencies and hundreds of state agencies, but the Board of Governors was uniquely situated to regulate almost all the mortgage market. This legal authority comes from, among other sources, the Truth in Lending Act, originally passed in 1968 but extended dramatically in 1994 to authorize the Fed to prohibit abusive practices in mortgage lending. As Engel and McCoy document, the Fed did not seek, and did not want the authority in the first place. The Fed's vice chair at the time in the Truth Lending Act's passage, J.L. Robertson, told Congress that the Fed lacked the expertise or staff to regulate mortgages and recommended that Congress place the authority within an agency better suited to perform the function. Congress disagreed, and the Fed became the primary regulator of mortgage practices in the country, in law but not in practice. Vice Chair Robertson's view of the Fed as a poor candidate for the job carried through, especially during the Greenspan era, of course. Crisis, postmortems, and notoriously prone to hindsight bias. It's very easy to see what went wrong after the fact, and the unfair to hold those in the past responsible for knowledge unviable to them, blaming the Fed for a failure to regulate mortgages. However, it's more plausible even after the fact. The question of the Fed's responsibility for mortgage practices was put to an active debate at the Board of Governors. One Clinton-era Fed governor, Edward Gramlich, was particularly struck by the mounting evidence that mortgage lending practices were violating the law and presenting significant risk to homeowners and to the broader financial system. While Gramlich was successful at forcing the Fed to expand some of its minor regulation, he was stymied by Greenspan from going any further. With respect to one key change, the publication of a voluntary code of conduct that would outline the best practices for mortgage lenders, Greenspan wouldn't budge. He never gave us a good reason, but he didn't want to do it, recalled one participant in the debates who, like Gramlich, pressed for greater regulation. He just wasn't interested. After the mortgage markets exploded, but before full depths of the 2008 financial crisis, Greenspan was defensive about accusations that he had failed as a regulator. His defense sounds a lot like Robertson, the vice chair who thought Congress should look somewhere else for a mortgage regulator, to a reporter covering the collapse of the subprime mortgage market. Greenspan admitted that he knew there were a lot of very questionable practices going on, but the problem was one of enforcement, and the Fed staff under Greenspan wasn't up to the job. The question is, who are the best enforcers? A large enough share of these cases are fraud, and those areas that I don't think the Fed staff are the best able to handle. Greenspan's legacy as a regulator will continue to be assessed as historians gain greater distance from the crisis and the Greenspan era. And although Greenspan had misfortune of publishing a clearly written memoir that outlined his ideological skepticism of government regulation on the eve of the greatest financial and regulatory crisis in 3 generations, he was far from alone in the ideological confidence in the successes of self-regulating markets. At the time, Democrats and Republicans alike embraced deregulation as a secret to unlocking the potential of the American economy, an ideology that comes up again throughout this book. But only the Greenspan Fed held the keys to the regulatory authority, and under his watch the regulatory apparatus that Congress had established and deposited into the Fed, sometimes against the central bankers' wishes, went largely unused. Looking back on Greenspan Federal Reserve, every aspect of the legacy has been called into question. The Fed's discretion is under assault, in a large part because of the deviations from predicted decision-making in the early 2000s. The Greenspan put became part of the entrenched mindset from the benefits of risk-taking in the market were for the market participants, but the costs were the public through the central bank, and the Greenspan Fed's regulatory failures are widely documented and criticized as central to the cause of the 2008 financial crisis. While Greenspan and the Fed generally haven't retained their luster since the financial crisis, each part of the Greenspan legacy is key to the story about the Fed. It is what it does. And in light of each aspect, the Ulysses Punch Bowl approach to the Fed independence starts to fall apart. Rock stars are not usually quiet chaperones, and the Fed's inflationary successes, the focus of the Ulysses conception of Fed independence, aren't helpful in explaining its regulatory failures. Conclusion: mapping the institutional geography of the Federal Reserve. The story of the Federal Reserve as the chaperone of the U.S. and global economy, the enforcer of the Ulysses contract, is a story of bureaucratic change unrivaled in American history. Part of that change was a way that two pieces of legislation, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the Banking Act of 1935, shaped its structure and defined its legal relationships to politicians. It also has to do with the power and leadership of the three chairmen highlighted above. Martin's defining role as a politician of the new central bank and his solidification of power within the Federal Reserve System. Volcker's personification of the central banker chaperone through the taming of inflation in the early 1980s, and Greenspan's crisis of the inflation-defying oracular feats as the god of the boom time economy, in the institutional developments that these chairmen wrought. Key features of the oversimplified Ulysses Punch Bowl vision of the Fed independence came into sharp relief. In the chapters ahead, we will see that there is more to show this story than that.